A powerful billionaire, a devoted wife, a secret affair that nearly cost them everything. When Elena collapses while pregnant, Nathan is forced to confront the devastating truth of his betrayal. Will love survive the wreckage, or is it already too late? This emotional roller coaster of lies, heartbreak, and redemption will leave you breathless. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping real-life stories you won't want to miss. He looked at her then, not the way a boss looks at an employee, but the way a man looks at someone he's starting to wonder about. When he reached for the wine bottle, their hands brushed. It was the briefest touch, but neither pulled away. Nathan cleared his throat. "You have ambition," he said. "And you find that dangerous?" she asked. "I find it familiar." They didn't kiss that night, but something between them was sealed in silence. From that point forward, Sasha was no longer just a rising star in the PR department. She was in his orbit. They began meeting more often in private, under the guise of campaign strategy, crisis meetings, rebranding sessions. It wasn't an affair, not yet, but it was something else. Something slipped. She started dressing differently, subtly, softer blouses, warmer lipstick. She began leaving the door slightly ajar when he visited, but only after checking who else was still in the office. She timed her coffee breaks to coincide with his. When they spoke, she leaned in just enough, not provocative, but intimate. She learned his tells, when he was stressed, when he was hiding something, when he was tempted. And Nathan started to crave her presence. Not because he didn't love Elena, at least that's what he told himself, but because Sasha made him feel seen again, powerful in a different way. He could talk business without emotional weight. He could be sharp and witty and desired without guilt. He convinced himself it was harmless. "She's smart. It's professional. I'm in control." But he wasn't, not really. One evening, he invited her to a private dinner after a long day of meetings. "We need to prep for the Hong Kong presentation," he said. The restaurant was quiet, dimly lit. She wore a midnight dew dress that clung to her shoulders like moonlight. They barely talked business. Instead, they laughed. Real laughter. Easy. By the time dessert arrived, the air was heavy with everything unspoken. He walked her to her car. She turned to him, keys in hand, eyes searching his. "Are we really pretending this is just business?" she asked. He didn't answer. He leaned in, brushing his lips against hers with dangerous softness. The kiss was brief, but it set off a chain reaction neither of them could stop. Back at home that night, Elena waited in bed, the ultrasound image resting on the nightstand. She'd lit a candle, prepared his favorite herbal tea. She glanced at the time. 10:17 p.m. He wouldn't be home for another hour, and when he arrived, the scent of unfamiliar perfume lingered faintly on his collar. She noticed. She always noticed. It had been a week since Elena had last seen Nathan during daylight hours. Most nights he returned home long after she'd gone to bed, the bedroom dimly lit by the small lamp she left on for him. She would hear the quiet shuffle of his shoes being removed, the soft click of his phone screen lighting up, the barely there sigh he gave before slipping under the sheets beside her. Sometimes he would place a hand gently on her belly, murmuring something half asleep. But it always felt rehearsed, disconnected, as if he were trying to remind himself what he was supposed to feel. Elena had grown used to the ache, the hollowness. The subtle shift in his behavior had started slowly, but now it was impossible to ignore. He no longer asked her how she was feeling or if the baby was kicking. He didn't comment on the nursery she'd spent weeks planning or the parenting books she left casually open on the kitchen counter. He barely noticed the swollen ankles, the sleepless nights, the small sounds she made when the baby moved inside her. She told herself it was the pressure of work, the expansion to Asia, the looming conference. He was under stress, she reasoned. But somewhere, deep inside, a colder truth had begun to take root. He was slipping away. Elena had always prided herself on being intuitive. She could read a room with a single glance, sense when something was off before anyone else noticed. It's what made her such a successful designer. But now, that same intuition whispered ugly things to her every time Nathan smiled too quickly, every time his phone buzzed and he turned the screen away. And she was tired of pretending not to hear it. One Friday morning, after waking alone once again, Elena made a decision. She would go to Nathan's office, not to spy, not to accuse, but to see him, to connect, to remind him, perhaps, of the life they were building, of the future growing inside her. She carefully dressed in a pale peach maternity dress, soft and elegant, paired with her favorite cream shawl. She applied a touch of blush to her cheeks and slipped on earrings Nathan had given her during their anniversary in Paris. She looked radiant. She hoped it would matter. The receptionist at Sterling Capital greeted her with a warm smile and led her to the top floor. Elena clutched a small envelope containing the latest ultrasound photos. Her favorite one was of their baby's profile. Tiny nose pressed against the curve of the womb, one hand resting like she was deep in thought. "She looks like you," the technician had said. Elena stepped out of the elevator, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Nathan's assistant, Christopher, greeted her with genuine surprise, and something else she couldn't place. Concern, perhaps? "Mrs. Sterling," he said with a nervous smile. "It's good to see you. Let me take you to Mr. Sterling's office." "Thank you, Christopher. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," he said, though his voice betrayed a flicker of hesitation. He knocked once before opening the office door. "Sir, your wife is here." Elena stepped in, heart fluttering with hope and something else. Something sharp. Nathan was seated behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him, legs crossed elegantly, a tablet in hand. She turned as Elena entered, rising smoothly to her feet. The woman was stunning, younger than Elena by a few years, perhaps, confident. Her smile was warm, but calculated. "You must be Elena," she said. "I'm Sasha Monroe." "I've heard so many wonderful things about you." Elena blinked. Sasha. The name was unfamiliar, but the unease in her chest spiked instantly. Something about the way she stood near Nathan, the curve of her smile, the slight hesitation in Nathan's eyes as he rose. "Elena," he said, moving around the desk to greet her. He kissed her cheek, too quickly, too formally. "What a surprise. I brought you the new ultrasound photos," Elena said, holding out the envelope. Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled slightly. "I thought you might want to see them." "Of course," Nathan said, taking the envelope. He opened it and stared at the images, his expression unreadable. "Wow, she's beautiful." "She is," Eleanor replied softly. She turned to Sasha. "I didn't realize Nathan had someone in his office." "Oh, we were just wrapping up," Sasha said smoothly, stepping aside and gathering her things. "Marketing strategy for the Asia rollout. Just logistics." Elena smiled politely, but inside, Her chest tightened. Something in Sasha's tone felt too familiar, too at ease. She glanced at Nathan, who offered nothing but a forced grin. "Would you like some tea, Mrs. Sterling?" Christopher asked, stepping in. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Sasha turned to Nathan. "I'll send over the revised brief by this evening." "Perfect," Nathan said. She nodded once more to Alina, then exited, leaving behind the faint scent of jasmine perfume and a silence that screamed. Elena waited until the door closed. She took a seat across from Nathan, slowly, carefully. "I wanted to take you to lunch," she said, voice softer now. "We haven't had lunch together in weeks." Nathan scratched the back of his neck. "Yeah, I've just got a lot going on. Maybe in a bit?" "It's Friday," she said, forcing a smile. "We used to always do lunch on Fridays." Nathan looked down at the ultrasound image again, then back at her. "Give me half an hour. I'll wrap this up." Elena nodded, though the hope she carried into the building was already slipping through her fingers. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. She sat in silence while Nathan pretended to read emails. Her hand rested gently on her belly. The baby kicked softly as if sensing her tension. Elena looked around the office, sleek, cold, a world she didn't recognize anymore. "I miss you, Nathan," she said quietly. He glanced up. "I'm right here." "No," she whispered. "You're not." He reached for her hand, held it for a second, and she let him, if only for the memory of who they used to be. But the ghost of Sasha lingered in the air between them, a presence Elena couldn't shake. Something had shifted, and she could feel, with painful clarity, that everything was beginning to unravel. The nursery smelled faintly of fresh paint and lavender oil, a scent Elena hoped would calm the baby when she arrived. It was supposed to be a space filled with joy. Plush toys lined the shelves, a white crib stood against the far wall, and pastel star decals danced across the ceiling. But that morning, it felt like a shrine to something unspoken. Elena sat in the rocking chair, sunlight falling in slanted lines across her lap. She cradled the ultrasound photo in her hand, running her thumb gently over the image of her baby's face, a hand pressed against a womb-shaped world, peaceful, trusting. She had tried, truly tried, to believe Nathan's distance was temporary. She had clung to the idea that work stress came in waves, that the chill in his voice, the polite but hollow responses would pass. But ever since the office visit, ever since seeing Sasha Monroe seated in Nathan's space like she belonged there, Elena's mind had been in freefall. She hadn't wanted to jump to conclusions. She wasn't that kind of woman. She wasn't paranoid. She didn't snoop. But that night, when Nathan finally returned home long after dinner had gone cold, and after she heard him texting in the dark instead of sleeping beside her, something inside her broke. He was in the shower when she did it. The tablet sat on his nightstand, charging. She hesitated for a long time, staring at it like it was a loaded weapon. Then, trembling slightly, she picked it up. His password was easy. Their anniversary. He never changed it. She opened his messages. Her breath caught. Sasha's name was pinned to the top. Her thumb hovered, then tapped. "Still thinking about last night? You taste like wine and trouble. Dinner was perfect. I wish we didn't have to hide. You look distracted today. Missing me already." A sound escaped Elena's lips, something between a gasp and a cry. She clasped a hand over her mouth as if to muffle the very truth pouring into her bloodstream like ice. Her vision blurred. She scrolled further, each message a dagger. She has no idea. You're the best part of my day. Let's escape, just the two of us. The tablet slipped from her hand and landed softly on the bed. Her body shook. She pressed both palms to her belly, as if to shield the baby from the storm within her. Her breath came in short bursts. She couldn't think, couldn't scream. She could only sit there, heart shattering in silence, while water ran behind the bathroom door. When Nathan emerged a few minutes later, wrapped in a towel, toweling his hair, he looked relaxed, almost happy, and she hated him for it. "Elena," he said casually, not noticing her expression. "I thought you were asleep." She didn't speak, just stared at him, her eyes glassy, unreadable. "You okay?" he asked, pausing. Still, she said nothing, because anything she said, anything at all, would destroy what remained of the lie she was barely holding together. The next morning, Elena woke early, having barely slept. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was racing. She couldn't eat, couldn't focus, and though she wanted to confront Nathan, every bone in her body screamed to wait. The baby. The baby came first. She had to stay calm, had to protect what was still untouched by his betrayal. Instead of unleashing her fury, she called Grace. "I found something," Elena said, her voice trembling. Grace didn't need details. She listened, offered silence first, then calm, practical advice. "Don't confront him when your heart's pounding like that," Grace said gently. "You're in your third trimester, Elle. This isn't just about heartbreak. It's about your health, your daughter's health." "I feel like I'm drowning," Elena whispered. "And he doesn't even see it." Later that day, something in her shifted. She needed to see it for herself again. Needed to face the source, the energy between them. Maybe it was reckless, but she didn't care. She got dressed slowly, carefully, and made her way to Sterling Capital without calling ahead. She moved with a quiet, determined grace through the building, every step deliberate. Christopher saw her the moment she walked in. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, startled. "Is everything all right?" "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a small smile. "I'd like to speak with Nathan." He hesitated. "He's in a meeting, boardroom, 16th floor, just wrapping up." She nodded, thanking him, and walked toward the elevator. When the doors opened, Elena stepped into a long hallway bathed in sterile corporate light. Through the glass wall of the boardroom, she saw Nathan at the head of the table, speaking with intensity. Sasha sat beside him, her expression soft but focused. Then Nathan leaned in, whispered something. Sasha smiled. Elena froze. She didn't cry, not yet. When the meeting ended and the room began to clear, Sasha caught her eye. Their gazes locked for a split second. Sasha offered a slight nod, a polite smile that felt almost smug, then walked away. Nathan spotted her a second later. His eyes widened. "Elena," he said, hurrying over, "is the baby okay?" She nodded, too composed. "I need to talk to you, in private." "Of course," he said, guiding her down the hallway. Back in his office, the door closed behind them. She remained standing. "There's something we need to talk about," she began. But before she could go on, the world tilted. The room spun. Her knees buckled. She felt herself falling. "Elena!" Nathan shouted, catching her just before she hit the floor. "Somebody help!" Everything blurred. Lights, voices, the edge of the desk. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as if from a distance. Then, everything faded. Outside, Christopher Allen rushed toward the commotion, panic etched across his face. Paramedics were called. A stretcher, a flurry of movement, gasps from employees watching from behind glass. Nathan sat beside her in the ambulance, his hand clutching hers, his heart pounding, his shirt soaked with sweat. He didn't know if the baby was okay, didn't know if Elena would ever forgive him. He only knew one thing. He had caused this. And as the sirens screamed and the city blurred around them, Nathan Sterling, master of control, realized that everything he cared about was now dangling by a thread. The hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft hum of filtered air. Elena lay motionless on the bed, her skin pale against the crisp white sheets, a faint flush returning to her cheeks as the IV dripped steadily into her arm. Nathan sat in the chair beside her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight, like if he let go, the world might crumble beneath him. The air felt heavy with consequence. He couldn't stop staring at her hand. So still, so delicate, as it rested atop the small rise of her belly. That same belly he'd barely touched in weeks. That same belly now carrying the child he'd almost lost because of his lies. The doctor entered quietly, clipboard in hand, her expression serious but not grim. Dr. Mariana Perez was known for her calm demeanor and sharp instincts. Nathan rose immediately, eyes searching hers for reassurance. "She's stable," Dr. Perez said. "The baby's heartbeat is strong. We'll monitor both of them closely, but for now, there's no immediate danger." Nathan exhaled, a sound that was half relief, half guilt. "What caused it?" Dr. Perez hesitated. "There was a sudden drop in blood pressure, likely stress-induced. Emotional strain during the third trimester can be more dangerous than most people realize." Her words hit Nathan like a gut punch. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "We'll keep her for observation. Minimal visitors, no stressful conversations," she added pointedly. He understood the unspoken message. Don't make this worse. When the doctor left, Nathan returned to Elena's side. He reached for her hand again and gently laced his fingers with hers. It felt like holding a memory, familiar but slipping. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "so sorry." Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with medication but still sharp enough to meet his. "Is the baby okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's okay," Nathan said, blinking back tears. "The doctors are just being careful." Elena let out a soft breath, her body sinking deeper into the bed. For a moment they sat there in silence, connected only by their entwined hands and the weight of what had almost been lost. Outside the room, Christopher Allen was speaking quietly with Dr. Perez. He'd been the first to rush in after Elena collapsed, the one who'd called the ambulance, the one who had watched with helpless horror as Nathan cradled his unconscious wife in his arms. Now, his concern lingered like a shadow. "She's been under stress for weeks," he told the doctor, "and I think I know why." Dr. Perez nodded. "We'll arrange for a psychologist to check in. Emotional wellness is just as important as physical health, especially now." Christopher hesitated. "There's more," he said. "You should know, this might not be just about the pregnancy. Something's been going on behind the scenes, with her husband, and someone at the company." The doctor gave him a long look, then scribbled something in her notes. "I appreciate you telling me." Inside the room, Nathan sat in silence, watching Elena as she drifted back into sleep. He remembered the first time he saw her cry, on their honeymoon in Amalfi, when a local artist painted a portrait of her and she'd been so moved by its honesty. He remembered how proud she looked when they signed the lease on their first apartment. How she'd danced barefoot in the kitchen the night he told her he was finally taking the company public. And now he remembered her collapse, the sheer terror of her body going limp in his arms, the guilt that wrapped around his throat as paramedics wheeled her through the lobby of Sterling Capital. What had he done? Later that afternoon, word of Elena's hospitalization had already spread through the office. Whispers snaked through hallways. Sasha heard the news while preparing a press statement. Her hands froze over her keyboard, and for the first time in weeks, her breath hitched. She hadn't meant for this to happen, not like this. The affair had been exciting, yes, a way to feel powerful, desired, but now the reality was setting in. A pregnant woman, his wife, had collapsed. Because of stress? Because of them? Still, she wasn't ready to walk away. Nathan didn't return to the office that day. He didn't respond to Sasha's texts either, but Sasha was persistent. That evening, when the building was nearly empty, she stopped by his office and sat in his chair. She stared out at the skyline and thought about everything she'd worked for. Her name was finally being mentioned in high-level meetings. She had control, influence. And now? She was being ignored. The next morning, Maria Gonzalez arrived at the hospital from Barcelona. Elena's mother burst into the room with tears already streaming down her face. "Mia," she whispered, rushing to Elena's side. "You scared me to death." Elena managed a weak smile as she leaned into her mother's embrace. "I'm okay now." Maria turned to Nathan, her eyes sharp with restrained fury. "You need to take care of her. No more stress, you hear me?" Her tone was gentle, but the meaning was a warning. Nathan nodded solemnly. "I promise." But even as he said the words, the guilt thickened. He could feel it in his chest like a weight pressing down. That night, after Maria and the nurses had stepped out to give Elena some rest, she turned to him, her voice thin but steady. "We need to talk." He braced himself. "Of course, anything." She stared at the ceiling, then down at her hands. "I know about Sasha," she said. The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "I saw the messages," she continued. "I didn't want to believe it, but I saw them." He looked at her, eyes brimming with shame. "Elena." She held up a trembling hand. "Not now. I don't want explanations. Not yet. I need to focus on staying healthy. For the baby. But once she's born, we're going to talk. Really talk." Nathan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I understand, whatever you need." She turned her face away from him, closing her eyes, and even though they sat just inches apart, the space between them had never felt wider. That night, Nathan remained by her side, but sleep never came. He listened to the soft beep of the heart monitor, the subtle shifts of the baby moving within her, the occasional sigh from Maria resting in the chair near the window. He felt like an imposter in his own life, a man who had everything and still managed to risk it all. And now, as dawn crept through the blinds, casting gold onto the floor, Nathan Sterling silently vowed that whatever came next, no matter how hard, he would face it. He would earn back their trust, or lose everything trying. The days that followed Elena's hospitalization passed in a haze of whispered instructions, quiet monitoring, and polite but strained conversations. Doctors came and went, adjusting medications, checking her vitals, reassuring her that the baby was growing fine, healthy, strong, unaffected by the emotional wreckage unraveling around her mother. Nathan was there, always at her side, dutiful and careful. Like a man tiptoeing through the ruins of his own creation, he held her hand, brought her water, sat quietly while her mother brushed her hair. But he never said more than he needed to, because Alina didn't want words. Not yet. At home, Maria hovered like a hawk. She cooked, she cleaned, she followed Alina's every move, gently scolding her when she tried to do too much, insisting on naps and herbal tea and feet elevated on the sofa. Nathan kept his distance when Maria was in the room. She never confronted him directly, but her eyes never stopped watching. She didn't need to yell. Her silence was louder than any accusation. Nathan, meanwhile, returned to the office for the first time since the incident, and the atmosphere was different. Not hostile, but watchful. Conversations stopped when he walked into a room. Assistants looked away when he passed. A few junior staff avoided eye contact altogether. He knew why. Rumors had bloomed in the halls of Sterling Capital like weeds, unspoken, unofficial, but persistent. It didn't help that Sasha Monroe was nowhere to be seen. She hadn't been fired. That would have caused more noise than silence. Instead, she'd been quietly reassigned, moved to a less public-facing role under the guise of strategic realignment. The truth, however, was known by more than a few. Nathan had made the decision himself, signing off on it late one night with a glass of scotch in one hand and a dull ache in his chest. The relationship had ended the moment Elena collapsed, but cutting off the affair was far easier than cutting off its consequences. Sasha didn't take it well. She had called him 3 times since the hospital. He ignored each one. The 4th time, she texted, "You don't just get to disappear." He didn't respond. Back at home, Elena was slowly regaining strength. She moved more cautiously now, not from physical pain, but from emotional weight. Her instincts were on edge, her spirit fractured, but not broken. She spent hours in the nursery folding tiny onesies, repositioning stuffed animals, sitting in the rocker staring into space. Grace visited often, always cheerful, always grounding. Sometimes they talked about the baby. Other times they didn't talk at all. One afternoon, while Nathan was at work, Elena confided in Grace. "I don't know what to feel," she admitted. "Sometimes I think I want to forgive him. Other times I hate him for what he's done, for what he risked." "You don't have to know yet," Grace replied gently. "You just have to keep breathing, one day at a time." That evening, after Nathan came home, he found Alina sitting in the kitchen, a bowl of untouched soup in front of her. She looked up at him, eyes tired, expression unreadable. "She called me," Elena said. Nathan froze. "Who?" "Sasha." His throat tightened. "What did she say?" Elena's jaw clenched. "She said I was naive, that I was a fool if I thought you could just walk away from her, that you two had unfinished business." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is she right?" Nathan took a step closer. "No. I haven't seen her since the hospital. I haven't spoken to her. I ended it." Elena's eyes shimmered. "Then why does it still feel like she's in this house, like she's in every silence between us?" He didn't have an answer. From the doorway, Maria watched them. She didn't say a word, but her fingers tightened around the tea towel she held. The next evening, there was a knock at the front door. Nathan opened it to find Christopher Allen standing on the porch, holding a slim manila folder. His face was drawn, his voice low. "I'm sorry to come by unannounced," Christopher said, glancing over Nathan's shoulder. But I thought you should see this." They moved to the study, shutting the door behind them. Inside the folder were printed emails, copies of messages Sasha had circulated to certain board members. In them, she painted herself as a victim, a young professional seduced by a powerful superior, then punished for not keeping her mouth shut. She attached screenshots of texts, carefully selected to frame Nathan as the manipulative aggressor. Nathan read each line in stunned silence, his face paling with every word. "She's building a case," Christopher said quietly. "If this leaks to the media, it won't just hurt your marriage. It could destroy the company." Nathan exhaled, dropping the papers onto the desk. "Why would she do this?" Christopher hesitated. "Because she's hurt, and ambitious, and because she doesn't think you'll fight back." Nathan stared at the wall, his jaw clenched. "Where'd you get this?" "Catherine Shields forwarded it to me. She's trying to get ahead of the crisis, but we're running out of time." Nathan rubbed his temples, exhaustion seeping into his bones. "I'll talk to her, one last time." Christopher looked doubtful. "You think she'll listen?" "She has to," Nathan said, though he didn't believe it himself. When he returned to the living room, Maria met him at the doorway. "I won't let you drag my daughter through any more of this," she said. "Do what you need to do, but keep Alina out of it." Nathan nodded, ashamed. "I will." Elena sat on the couch, a hand resting on her belly, her body smaller somehow in the shadows of the room. He walked to her slowly and knelt beside her, his voice low. "I'm going to fix this, I swear to you. I'm meeting with Sasha tomorrow, and then I'll do whatever it takes to protect you and our daughter. Even if I have to walk away from my company, I will." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I want to believe you, Nathan. But if you fail, I won't forgive you." "I can't." He bowed his head. He knew she meant every word. The upscale hotel lounge was dimly lit, its mahogany panels and gold accents casting a warm, deceptive glow. A jazz pianist played somewhere near the bar, the soft notes drifting through the air like whispers. Nathan sat alone in a secluded corner booth, a glass of untouched bourbon in front of him, hands folded tightly on the table. His reflection stared back at him from the mirror behind the bar. Tired eyes, jaw clenched. A man unraveling. He checked his watch. 7:03 p.m. She arrived 3 minutes later. Sasha Monroe stepped into the room wearing a sleek black coat, her dark hair pulled into a low chignon, eyes sharp with a mix of anger and pain. She spotted him immediately. He stood as she approached, but she didn't offer her hand. She simply slid into the booth opposite him, her movements precise, controlled. "You wanted to talk," she said, her voice cool but vibrating with suppressed emotion. "Go ahead. I'm all ears." Nathan took a slow breath. "This can't go on, Sasha. The emails, the messages to the board, you're putting everything at risk." Her eyes flashed. "I'm putting things at risk?" she said, her voice rising just slightly. "You're the one who seduced me, Nathan. You're the one who promised it wasn't just about sex, that we had something real." "I never promised anything," he said quietly. "You knew I was married." "And that stopped you how?" she shot back. He looked away. The music swelled for a moment, then faded again. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope, placing it gently on the table between them. "What is this?" Sasha asked. "A letter to the board. Full responsibility, my name only. You're not mentioned. I make it clear that the relationship was inappropriate, that I initiated everything and that your reassignment had nothing to do with retaliation." She didn't reach for the envelope, just stared at it, jaw tightening. "I'm also including a professional recommendation," he continued. "You've been brilliant at what you do, that doesn't change, but this has to end here. No more threats, no more emails. Please." Sasha's eyes narrowed. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I'm not trying to save myself. I'm trying to save my family," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "My wife nearly lost our baby." For a long moment, Sasha didn't speak. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man who once made her feel powerful and desired, but someone worn down, haunted. A man who'd finally realized the weight of what he'd done. "I didn't want this to become a scandal," she said at last. I felt used, discarded." "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry for everything." She reached out and picked up the envelope, turning it over in her hands. Her fingers traced the seal, slow and hesitant. "Would you really do this?" she asked. "Risk your name, your company?" "I already have," he replied. "Now I'm just trying to make it right." Sasha leaned back in the booth, exhaling. For the first time since she walked in, her shoulders sagged. The fight in her eyes dimmed slightly. "You know," she said, half smiling, "what I liked most about you? You always go all in, no matter how stupid." He gave a hollow laugh. "That makes two of us." She tapped the envelope once more, then slid it into her purse. "Fine," she said. "I won't send anything else. I'll back off. But I'm not staying at the company. It's tainted now." "I understand," Nathan said, "and I'll help however I can." Quietly. Sasha nodded. She stood, adjusting her coat. "I hope your wife gets better," she said, "and I hope you mean it when you say you're done." "I do." She lingered for just a second, eyes searching his one last time, and then walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Nathan sat back, exhaling, letting the silence settle around him. The bourbon was still untouched. He didn't want it anymore. When he returned home that night, the house was quiet. Elena was sitting in the nursery, the overhead star lamp casting soft shadows across the walls. She was rocking slowly, her hand resting on her belly, her expression distant. He knocked gently on the door frame. She looked up. "I talked to her," he said. Elena said nothing, waiting. She agreed to stop everything. I gave her a signed statement, a letter to the board. I took full responsibility. Elena's eyes didn't blink. "And?" "She's leaving the company. It's over." For a moment, all he could hear was the faint creak of the rocking chair. Then Elena spoke. "Thank you." He stepped inside, careful, slow. "I know that doesn't fix it." "No," she said. "It does." Nathan swallowed hard. "But I needed you to know I chose us. Finally." She nodded once, but her gaze lingered on the mobile above the crib, spinning slowly. Then she winced. "Elena?" he said, rushing to her side. She pressed a hand to her belly, breathing sharply. I think something's happening." Within minutes, the house exploded into motion. Maria called Grace. Nathan grabbed the go-bag. The car ride to the hospital was a blur of streetlights and tightening contractions. Elena clutched his hand, her knuckles white, her breaths short and focused. Hours later, as dawn crept through the hospital windows, Elena gave birth to a baby girl. She was tiny and loud and perfect. They named her Carmen. Nathan stood by Elena's side, overwhelmed, silent tears slipping down his face as he held his daughter for the first time. She was everything. She was a second chance wrapped in a swaddle blanket. Elena, still pale and exhausted, looked up at him. "For her?" she whispered. "We try, not for us, but for her." He nodded, unable to speak. And in that moment, surrounded by quiet and light and the soft, steady beat of new life, Nathan Sterling knew what redemption might look like. Not a grand gesture, not a single act of bravery, but 1,000 small choices, every single day, starting now. The first few days after Carmen's birth were a whirlwind of exhaustion, tenderness, and cautious joy. The hospital room was filled with soft light and even softer moments. Elena resting with her newborn curled against her chest. Nathan hovering nearby like a man who had just glimpsed the edge of a cliff and stepped back in time. Nurses moved in and out with warm smiles and careful hands, adjusting monitors, offering water, guiding Elena through her first attempts at nursing. Maria never left her daughter's side. She stayed silent most of the time, watching Nathan closely, her expression unreadable. She didn't trust easily anymore, not after everything, but she respected the effort he was making. Nathan was different, quieter, gentler. Each time he held Carmen, something shifted in him. The sharp businessman, the calculating CEO, was gone. In his place was a man cradling 7 pounds of fragile hope. He sang lullabies in a voice too low for anyone but the baby to hear. He offered to do every diaper change. He woke before the nurses to rock Carmen when she fussed. And Elena saw it. She saw all of it, but she didn't yet know what to do with it. The wound inside her wasn't closed just because their daughter had arrived. She loved her baby with a kind of ferocity that surprised even her. But love for Nathan was something more complicated. Tangled in betrayal and trust that had been shaken to the core. They were released from the hospital 3 days later, the sun shining, the air warm with late spring. Back home, the nursery was exactly how Elena had left it, except now, it wasn't empty. Carmen's tiny cries filled the space that had once echoed with silence. The mobile spun, the stars dancing above her crib, and yet even amid the beauty, the newness, the rhythm of parenthood, the ache between Elena and Nathan remained. They moved around each other like careful dancers. He took night shifts without being asked. She handed him bottles without meeting his eyes. Conversations were brief, necessary, functional. Maria helped, filling the space with small talk, with meals, with an extra pair of arms when one of them needed to step away. One night, a week after they came home, Elena sat in the rocker while Carmen slept, her eyes locked on the shadows on the nursery wall. Nathan entered quietly, holding 2 mugs of tea. He set one down beside her and lingered, unsure if he should stay. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. Elena didn't look up right away. She just nodded. He pulled a chair closer. Sat. Waited. "I've been trying to give you space," he said. "But I also don't want to pretend everything's fine when it isn't." She turned to him slowly, her face unreadable. "It's not fine, but I know you're trying." "I am," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I think about what I did every single hour. I think about the moment you collapsed, about almost losing you, losing her, and I hate myself for letting it get that far." "You didn't just let it happen," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "You chose it. over and over. You let someone else into our life, into our story. He lowered his gaze. I know. Elena sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. And now, every time you hold our daughter, I feel this twist inside me. Because I want to believe the man you are with her is the real you. But I also can't forget the man you were with her. She didn't need to say Sasha's name. Nathan sat in silence, absorbing her words like a blow to the chest. I'll go to counseling, he said quietly, if you want. I'll do whatever it takes, even if it means you don't forgive me, even if you decide not to stay. I just want to be the kind of man Carmen can be proud of. I want to show her how a man should love, and I want to show you that I can be better. Elena's eyes filled with tears, not from anger, not even from grief, but from the overwhelming weight of still caring. It would have been easier if she'd stopped loving him, cleaner, but she hadn't. She wiped at her cheek. We'll start with counseling, she said. But don't expect miracles. I won't, he said, finally exhaling. Just a chance. From that night forward, things didn't magically fix themselves. But the process began. They started going to therapy twice a week. The first few sessions were brutal, raw. Elena cried more than she spoke. Nathan sat through it all, listening, acknowledging every cruel truth she spoke aloud. Sometimes he tried to explain. Other times he just apologized. There were nights they didn't sleep in the same room, days they barely touched. But slowly, layer by layer, something started to shift. They found tiny moments to rebuild trust. Nathan deleting Sasha's number in front of Elena, turning off his phone during dinner, showing up to counseling on time, every time, letting himself be vulnerable in front of her, not just once, but repeatedly. And Elena, though cautious, let herself be seen too. Let herself grieve, express the rage she'd buried during pregnancy, the betrayal that had nearly broken her. Carmen became their common ground, their fragile, beautiful bridge. The way she smiled in her sleep, the way she curled her fingers around theirs. They watched her grow day by day, and in doing so rediscovered slivers of the connection they once had. Not the fairy tale version, not the polished image, but something more honest. Still, the road wasn't easy. Tension returned one evening when Elena received a call from a reporter. An anonymous tip had surfaced about infidelity inside Sterling Capital's executive ranks. Nathan's name wasn't mentioned, but the implication was clear. Elena hung up, her hands shaking. Nathan made a public statement the next day, carefully worded, crafted with legal counsel, but honest. He acknowledged a lapse in judgment and personal matters that impacted the company's atmosphere. He took responsibility, and Sasha, true to her word, stayed silent. Back home, Elena watched him walk in after the press conference. He looked drained, but resolute. I meant what I said, he told her. All of it. She stepped forward, uncertain, then placed her hand gently on his chest. He covered it with his own. They stood that way for a long time. Eventually, months passed. Carmen's cries turned into coos into giggles. The nursery filled with new sounds. Songs, stories, laughter. The house began to feel like a home again. Not because the past was erased, but because they chose, every day, to keep showing up. And one morning, as sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, Nathan poured coffee into 2 mugs and handed one to Elena. She took it, their fingers brushing. For the first time in a long while, she smiled. And this time, it reached her eyes. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this emotional journey. Stories like Nathan and Elena's remind us that love is not always perfect, and trust, once broken, is never easy to rebuild. But they also show us the power of accountability, patience, and the courage it takes to try again, even when it hurts. In life, we all make mistakes. What truly defines us is how we choose to face them. Maybe you saw a part of yourself in this story. Maybe you're in the process of healing, forgiving, or starting over. Wherever you are in your journey, remember this: it's never too late to be better, to make things right, or to choose love with more honesty than before. We'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and tell us your story. And if this video touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel. We're here to bring you more powerful stories that speak to real emotions, real relationships, and real change. Thank you again, and until next time, take care and never stop believing in second chances.